So it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome you for tonight's dinner and event. And, please feel free during my speech and proceedings to grab more food or grab more drinks. This really is intended to be a celebration of our community, but a celebration also with a purpose. My name is Alex Cooley, and I have the privilege of being the current director of the Harriman Institute. I'm also a professor of political science at Barnard College, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's event on the launching of our oral history project, Cold Wars in the Academy, an oral history on Russian regional studies. The origins and the idea of this actually lie with the former director, our esteemed and beloved Gati who Gati always had wonderful ideas about things that the Institute could do and be done. And my understanding that at some point Gati asked Laura Nettlefield, is Laura here today? Laura, who was then a postdoc, Laura, you should check out some of the archives of the Institute, and why don't you write up a history of us? And I think Laura completely was concerned about the request, but again, the idea was right. And so Laura, we've started on the job tonight. Her instincts were right for a number of reasons. One, her tragic passing, along with other members of our community, Bob Belknap, of course, Marshall Schulman, emphasized to us how precarious some of our institutional memory really is. That a lot of what we assume to be common knowledge about who we are and what we do could not necessarily be taken for granted. And then another development happened in 2014. All of a sudden, because of, I think, some situation in Crimea maybe, people started asking again, why don't we have any Russian regional specialists, right? Why don't we have any Ukrainian regional specialists? Who is training the next generation of professionals with deep area knowledge? And of course, to those of us familiar with the Institute, this is a recurring theme, right? And a question of regional studies and its place in training. So what you see before us, and I encourage everyone to grab copies of the magazine, I think are available in the front desk with bookmarks with the website of the Oral History Project. It's the culmination of a project that began over 3 years ago, features 26 narrators from different decades in the Institute, a website, and over the next years we will continue to add narrators to the archive and build on what we have. And the idea here is to keep this alive and evolving part of our community, our self-reflection on who we are and some of the themes. And also we would love to translate the archive into Russian too, so that Russian scholars can also see how we've been studying them and some of our own institutional dilemmas and debates that we have. I don't want to get into too many of the themes substantively of the archive. This is a night for the panelists, but I do want to point to, I think, a couple of lessons that have emerged. One is the Cold War exerted profound and a transformative impact on many of our nation's universities, and the Russia Institute and the Harriman Institute is one of those places. Ours is perhaps a special status, maybe burden, but also privilege, of having been the first academic institute founded in 1946, devoted to the study of Russia and the Soviet Union. And we, of course, renamed ourselves after their generous gift from the Harriman family in 1982. But in general, the Cold War brought in large pools of outside money. It encouraged interdisciplinarity, privileged the study of certain regions, and cemented the link between policy-relevant research and the role of the scholar practitioner. And that had positives, I would argue, and negatives. In short, the history and study of area studies is a study on how political trends have intersected with institutional pressures, university politics, to help shape our own understanding of the outside world. And I'm actually grateful to Steve Cohen, who reportedly at our advisory board meetings makes this point too, that area studies is also the study of us and who we are and our values and reflections, in as much as it is the study of the region over there. But as it turns out, this myth of Sovietology being privileged and being a golden era has some problems with it. There were lots of systematic exclusions and high barriers to entry, even in this field. Exclusions based on gender or status as an unreliable emigre, as it turns out. Sharp decades about the Institute's role in academia in the Vietnam era. Similarly, though, the much attributed decline of regional studies post-Cold War also deserves some scrutiny. Because as it turns out, everything didn't just disappear when the Soviet Union disappeared. Sure, the raison d'etre of Sovietology disappeared, but all of a sudden we had new countries to study and new fields to develop. Fields like the study of nationalities. I see Alex Model here, who has been so pioneering in that. Harriman has incubated and hosted the Association of Nationalities Conference annually. It's something we're very proud of. And also, this foray into comparative imperial and post-imperial studies, too, was another intellectual current. No longer just training specialists in government or academia, we also saw our community members go into places in the private sector, in non-for-profits, in fields like human rights and journalism and many others. So the end of the Cold War was actually far richer and more dynamic than many accounts would lead you to believe. And again, I think this is all captured nicely in the archive. Very finally, I do want to say some thank yous. I know sometimes this can go on, and I want to try and pare them down as much as possible. But with a project like this, of just this duration and labor, I want to give some full credits and acknowledgement here. I do want to thank SIPA for their enduring support. Even though we're no longer part of SIPA, this institutional history is also about SIPA. And our new home in the arts and sciences, now for 10 years. And I'm especially appreciative of the Office of the EVP to support us in our efforts to broaden the range of partnerships that we have across the university and really to adjust our regional studies program so it best serves the needs of our students in the 21st century and the challenges that they face. I want to thank the students. There are 2 tables of students here in our oral history class. You guys are it. You're the next generation. And of course, you know, there's no such thing as a free dinner, so you're writing papers on this. On the other hand, I'm already struck by just what extraordinary experiences and backgrounds you have, and just really excited. You are going to be the ones who forge and do different things. And I think one of the really amazing things about regional studies is that it's an ecosystem that's really dynamic, and that all of you, I think, will make interventions in, and hopefully you can come back and tell us about your contributions in the future. I want to thank all 26 narrators for being here. Colleagues, fellow faculty members, NAC members, your stories are absolutely invaluable and priceless. And the information that you've shared has been deeply personal, and we're grateful for that. You know, we're especially appreciative of your enduring commitment to Harriman and your membership of this extraordinary community. And I also want to thank the Columbia Center for Oral History Research and Insight for their amazing partnership. Thank you, Mary Marshall, to you and to all of your colleagues for making this truly a labor of love. I didn't think that, you know, frankly, I could find an organization that cared as deeply as you do about the Institute and getting it right. And I think when I embarked on this, that was my fear, like, can we get it right? Can this be something that we're proud of? And you've just been just fantastic partners, so thank you for that. And then very finally, just 2 individuals to give a shout out to. The first is our own Masha Udensiva-Brenner. Masha, can you raise your hand or stand up? So 3 years ago, when I had just moved into the 12th floor, I kind of sort of invited Masha into the office and said, hey, Masha, you're going to run point on oral history. And, you know, back then we didn't have too many details. We were filling out the details as we went, but Masha just took to it and helped run the project. Also, she is the author of an article on oral history in the latest magazine. I would encourage everyone to look at that. And just in general, she's been so positive and so amazing to work with on this. All this on top of her regular communications duties and running the magazine. And now she joins us away from baby Nikolai. So congratulations for that. So we're just really so thankful to have you here. And then very finally, by way of introduction, I want to introduce our moderator for today's panel. George Gavrilis has been a friend and an advisor who also deeply cared about the project. George doesn't want me to delve into his bio, and I won't too much, but let me just say this. George has had several quite skilled positions, ranging from an academic and political scientist to running the Halling Center for International Dialogue in DC. And George, I think, really found his calling working on oral histories and really bringing out the stories of institutions and individuals in an exceptional way. And so we've been so lucky that he has helped us translate our goals and our institutional architecture into this project that you have with you. So again, it's a real pleasure to have him as a member of our community. So let me now invite our four panelists up to the podium. Let me invite Ron Suny and Jeri Labor and Toby Gati and Steve Cohen, as well as George. And I think we'll have just a quick photo here before I hand things over to you. But again, thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's so special to see everyone networking and bonding, and the Harriman Institute, I hope you'll regard as your continuing home.
Everyone, thank you for coming. Alex, thank you for the introduction. And oral history wouldn't be what it is without really wonderful interviewers that sit in front of the narrators and prepare and really think about the subject matter and the questions, and oftentimes research the hell out of a really small subject, a sub-subject on a single question they might ask the narrator about. So having said that, thank you, Mary Marshall, for your interviews for the project. And thank you to Christina Pei, who also happens to be here and is one of Mary Marshall's students, and a couple of our other interviewers who couldn't be here tonight, Caitlin Mahue and also Bill McAllister, who many of you may know from Insight and his work previously at ISERB. So, having said that, I'd like to make very quick biographic introductions because I think for the purposes of what we're doing here, since many of you know each other around the table, I think people want to hear more about what you said in the oral history than what you've done in life as it appears on a short bio. So immediately to my left is Ronald Grigor Suny. He is William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan. To his left is Jeri Labor, who is co-founder of Human Rights Watch, executive director of the former Helsinki Watch, and like Ron, also a graduate of the Harriman Institute, or the then Russian Institute. To Jeri's left is Toby Gati. She's at Akin Gump's offices in Washington, D.C., and she served in government as many of you may know. She was U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research in the 1990s. And to her left, last but not least, we have Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies at New York University and of Politics at Princeton University. All of them alumni, graduates of the Russian Institute or today's Harriman Institute. So I'm going to ask a few questions across the panel, the entire panel, and then open it up to you to ask questions, make comments, express your thoughts. And of course, before all else, invite you, if you haven't already, to visit the online pages of the Harriman Oral History. There's a lot of wonderful material that the panelists here delivered, but that many of the other panelists as well. So the first question that I would like to ask each of our panelists is the following. Now, there were many, many wonderful stories in the oral history, and you all shared a number of wonderful stories. But I'm wondering, in terms of a story that you find very memorable and that you'd like to share with people around the room, something that you can express in 2 or 3 minutes, an experience that you had in the former Soviet Union, an experience you had here at the Harriman, or an experience moment where you deployed your policy knowledge. What would that story be? What does that story look like? Ron, I'll start with you.
So the Russian Institute, as it was called then, was not just Russian. It was about the whole Soviet Union, and our area was quite broad. And I was interested in Transcaucasia. Nobody was interested in Transcaucasia, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. But those were the good days. It was easy to get a job. You could get tenure. So you chose to do what you wanted to do. And I did. And no one bothered us. I wasn't a Kremlinologist. I wasn't guessing who stood next to Brezhnev or whatever. I was doing my thing. And everything was fine. And then the Soviet Union began to crack, fall apart. It started in the Caucasus, you may remember, in Karabakh, with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Then the Baltic regions followed. And suddenly the phone rang one day at my mother's house. And this voice said, "Professor Suny?" I said, "Yes." Said, "We'd like you to come to Washington to talk to us." And I said, "Really? Who are you?" I said, "We're the Central Intelligence Agency." I said, "Do you know anything about me?" And they said, "We know all about you." And I would say, Alex, that was when regional knowledge came to play. And for the next 10 or 12 years, I would go steadily. I always told my students what I was doing. I had no clearances or anything like that, and enjoyed trying to inform them about the nature of ethnic conflict, how it wasn't primordial tribal struggles, but was constructed political challenges to one to another. And it seemed we had some little influence. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it was a great experience, and I thank the Russian Institute for that.
Jeri.
In 1954, a year after Stalin died, I was one of 4 Russian Institute students that were given the extraordinary opportunity to travel as tourists in the Soviet Union. This was unprecedented. We were the first group to go in there after the death of Stalin. And we had studied the Soviet Union as if we were studying Mars. None of us ever thought we would ever actually get there to see it, and here we were traveling. It was an amazing trip. I wish I had time to talk about it in detail, but it lasted a month. We covered about 7,000 miles. We visited 6 cities and 3 republics, and were given a very high-class tour. It was a test run, and they wanted it to succeed, and they treated us very well. Now, before we left, Time magazine gave us 32 rolls of film. They wanted to do a big picture story on our trip. And we were assured by the U.S. Embassy that we could take that film out of the country undeveloped, which had not been the case before, but the law had changed. So when I got to customs in Leningrad Airport, I opened my suitcase, and there on the top were some rolls of film, and they said, "Oh, sorry, you can't take unprocessed film out of the USSR." And I said, "Oh, yes, I can." And they said, "Oh, you can't." And the film happened to be Kodak film, which was Kodachrome film, which was brand new at the time and could only be developed in a Kodak lab. And when I explained that to them, then they really got their backs up, and they said, "Our Soviet scientists can process anything, and you have to leave the film here." So I didn't know what to do. I was alone. My 3 traveling companions had left the day before for Moscow. I didn't know anyone in Leningrad. There was no U.S. consulate there at the time. And I had about less than $10 in my wallet. And I was also very eager to get home. I was about to get married 3 weeks after my arrival home. So I could see the plane out there on the field. It was waiting for me. The time had come and gone, and they were still sitting there waiting for me. And I did something very impulsive. I took the film that was on the top of my suitcase. I put it down on the counter. I closed the suitcase and started running for the plane, knowing that underneath my clothes there were at least half as much film still there, which I hoped they hadn't seen. I got to the plane, the doors closed the minute I got on it, the engines revved up. I thought, thank God I've made it, and then I heard the engines die. The doors opened, and came the 2 customs officials. They said, "Please open your suitcase." I did. They took the rest of the film, and they sent me on my way. The film actually did arrive 6 months later by way of the U.S. Embassy. They'd processed it for black and white, and it was totally ruined. I was very ashamed of the way I handled that whole thing. First of all, I had done something really stupid. I had lied to a Soviet customs official. I tried to smuggle film out of the country. They could have arrested me. They would have had a right to. They didn't. But what really bothered me was that I felt I mishandled the whole thing, that I should have stood my ground, I should have refused to leave, I should have let the plane go without me, I should have insisted on seeing a higher up in the bureaucracy and fought the thing through and tried to get my own way. I thought that I had failed in my one opportunity to stand up to Soviet officials. I didn't know that in my future career I would have many more such opportunities. And I think I acquitted myself well.
Thank you. My history at the Institute is very much wound up with another institute that was in this building, the Research Institute on Communist Affairs. Now, the name will tell you how long ago this was. It then became the Research Institute on International Change. This was Brzezinski's institute. And I came here as Brzezinski's research assistant, which was an experience, a great job, fact-checking, doing whatever I had to do. And every week I had 5, maybe 8 minutes to present what I had done the last week. And so what you learned, obviously, during that time was be brief and say something important, because next time you'll have 1 minute, and then the next time after that you'll have no minutes. Well, I was researching books for him, Fragile Blossom, Between Two Ages, some of the books you may know, and an article he did for Foreign Affairs. And I read it, and it was very dense, a lot of facts, and I was getting confused. It was all about US and Europe and Russia. So I made a chart of every fact that he had in it, and I found out he had left some out. He had just forgotten, and when I went in, I said, Dr. Brzezinski, it's a good article. I mean, I didn't know what to say, you know, but you've left some things out. And he did what he does, you know, the eyebrows went up and the lips, sort of, and he said, oh, what did I leave out? And I told him what he left out. And he said, well, fix it and come back next week with all the information, give it to me, and I'll give you a footnote in the article. And so I did. And when I walked out, I thought, I don't believe I just did that. I told Dr. Brzezinski that he got an incomplete. And I did the charts. And I worked with him for a long time, and I also worked, was very close to Marshall Schulman, who was a different kind of person. He never would have, you never would have been afraid of Marshall. Marshall was your friend. But Brzezinski relished contrary views. When the revolution came to Columbia, they came to the building, the students, with a pig on a plate. And this was Brzezinski, he was the pig. And he came down to greet them, which he kind of enjoyed that kind of thing. Okay, fast forward. Well, I'm not going to fast forward. I'm going to say the most important thing that happened to me at Columbia is I met my husband, who was at Brzezinski's Institute, and I was his research assistant before I became Brzezinski's, but I said, there's one thing I'll never do, and I'll never take a class with you, because I didn't know if he'd grade me fairly. So, but we've been married for 44 years, so something worked out well. Fast forward, I'm going to work for President Clinton as special assistant to the president for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And then I went over to the State Department to be assistant secretary. I had introduced Governor Clinton to Boris Yeltsin because I knew a lot of people in Russia and I knew a lot of people in the embassy. So I was at the first briefing for Clinton as he came in president, and everybody was really, really nervous. And I'm just kind of sitting there and I'm waiting, and you know, Clinton was always late, so we were waiting a long time. And they said, why aren't you nervous? And I said, well, if you briefed Zbigniew Brzezinski and lived to tell the tale, then briefing Clinton is a piece of cake. And it really was. So I want to say that I used all the skills that I had at Columbia in the White House. Some of those skills have stood me very, in good stead all the time, which is you have to be brief, you have to be concise, You can't assume that people know everything, and you can't assume people are going to agree with you. Then the key lesson that I really got from Columbia is that whatever you get, and I'm talking to the students here mainly, whatever you learn, if you go into government, that's the foundation of what you're going to have. You're not going to have any time to add to that. You're not going to have any time to read long books. Not going to have any time to do anything. So you better use your time here to just, get as much knowledge as you can. The other conclusion I will say, and there are people here who have been in the intelligence and the policy community, is policy is messy, and you don't always get what you want. I know that's a song, but, And if you're a woman, it's even tougher. I can assure you, I've gone into many meetings where they said, please sit down, gentlemen. I didn't know whether to sit or keep standing. And the other thing I learned was listen to the Russians you know. They have a lot to tell you. And no matter what else you do, never betray a confidence of the people that you've met. No matter what you would get out of it, it's just not worth it. So that's what Columbia taught me, and that's my career led in ways that I never have known, because before I came to Harriman Institute, I majored in Russian literature. And I know that many of you, if you've majored in, had the same conversation with your parents. What are you going to do with that? And it turned out that it worked out very well, and I would just say, if you love it, do it. Thank you.
I don't have a story or a lesson. Some people think I never learned any lessons, so I don't want to lay anything on the Russian Institute. When I got from George the instruction that I should think of something anecdotal but ramifying, I couldn't. But now I do. It's Lauren Graham, Professor Lauren Graham. He's been a kind of mentor over the years. If anybody could tell the tale of Russian studies in this country, it's Lauren Graham. What you behold, I guess, is where you come from. Except for Birmingham, England, I lived my whole life in small Midwestern and Southern American cities. I grew up in Kentucky. I went to Indiana University. I lived a couple years in South Florida. I got the Russia bug at Indiana from my first mentor, and really my only lasting mentor, Robert C. Tucker, whom Lauren knew well too. And I came to the Russian Institute. I never did anything in my life by plan. Nothing. But I ended up here for family reasons. Came east. And for me, this was, in the 1960s, an absolutely wondrous and wonderful place. It was what Russians call živaya istoria. You couldn't exist on the Columbia campus in Russian studies or on the Upper West Side without feeling you were inside the history of the Russian Revolution. As I recall, Lauren, maybe I'm wrong, but Kerensky was still alive and living on Fifth Avenue. Boris Nikolaevsky, the famous Menshevik historian, lived in one of these townhouses around here. On the faculty, among my teachers, were children of what I call the diaspora of the Russian Revolution, the losers, you might say. One was Professor Florensky, who embodied Tsarist Russia. One was Alex Dahlin, who carried on the Menshevik tradition in his own way. Another was Alexander Ehrlich, who helped me a lot with my dissertation, whose father, I believe, had been shot with Adler by Stalin as representatives of the Jewish Socialist Bund. I hope I don't make a historical mistake. And in some ways, for me, above all, was John Hazard. He wasn't a child of the Russian Revolution. He was a priomny sin. He was adopted sin. He went and lived and studied. Was he a Quaker? Yeah, Quaker fellowship. And I think his letters that he had to write are here at the university someplace. But John had studied as a kind of graduate student in Moscow in the 1930s. And his most famous teacher, Pashukanis, was shot. So here I was out of Kentucky with the notion of writing a dissertation on Bukharin. And here, not far from me, was my own supervisor, Rukovoditelь, John Hazard, who had attended Bukharin's lectures in Moscow. I mean, sat in the same room with him. And around the corner was Boris Nikolaevsky, who had had this famous last, we still don't know exactly what happened, series of meetings with Bukharin in Paris before Bukharin went home and was arrested. The worst memory I have from being at the Russian Institute at Columbia, there was at that time next to Butler Library a tennis court where Susan Hoyman periodically dragged me over there and wouldn't let me win one game of a set. It was 6-0, 6-0, and I stalked off. And there she sits, and you could just look at her and know she could do it again today. So the lesson I learned at Columbia was I wasn't going to be a professional tennis player. The larger takeaway was, and I'll sort of wrap down on this and then tell a silly story at the end, one-liner. For me, there couldn't have been a better place to go to graduate school. The place, I think you could probably quantify this, but I doubt that any other center, university center in America, had such a large, outstanding assembly of senior scholars. I was counting the other night about 7. I couldn't remember fully the literature, because Simmons, I think, had retired by then, or was about to, and Mosley was about to retire. But if we add them up, I came here in '62, and stayed here till '68, more or less, when I went off to teach at Princeton. This was really an amazing constellation of senior people. And they didn't agree about much of anything, and that was the best part. Because a conformity came over Russian studies, not total, but quasi-conformity later. And there was no conformity at Columbia in the early 60s. These guys came out of Menshevik, socialist, czarist, different intellectual traditions. Some were quasi-Marxist, some were anti-Marxist. It didn't matter. And they were democratic with their students. They didn't care if you studied with Ehrlich or Dahlin or whomever was Hazard. The door was open to you. So that was really the best part of it. So I'll end by saying this. Somebody referred to, was it you, Toby, 1968 as a revolution. It wasn't a revolution, but everybody pretended it was. I was here. And people who studied the Russian Revolution thought this was great. We missed the Russian Revolution, but now we could observe it firsthand, you know. It's like I tell my kids, you missed the Cold War, good, you get a chance to see it again. We're in a new one. But it was interesting. I remember those days vividly. And I don't remember exactly how Russian studies faculty reacted to the students. In a couple cases I do. But I remember there was a certain unease. Several of the people here had bad run-ins with McCarthy, John Hazard in particular, really bad. He didn't tell everybody the story, but he told some of us. But there was something that made the Russian studies faculty uneasy, or at least attentive. It got their attention, 1968. But all I can say is that as the events of '68 were unfolding, and I was teaching a course called Radical Thought for a guy called Herb Dean in the government department. That was my way I made money. I taught. Brzezinski also gave me to his credit. He said it was his worst mistake ever, but I'm sure he was kidding. He gave me a fellowship in that institute. So famous intelligentsia around New York would come up here to observe the revolution. And one day, Dwight MacDonald, does anybody remember Dwight MacDonald? So Dwight MacDonald was this famous New York, one-time Trotskyist intellectual, who is now an editor and a writer, very well known, and had once been a communist Trotskyist. In fact, apparently Trotsky said about him, when MacDonald broke with Trotsky, everybody's entitled to make a mistake. Everybody has the privilege of making a mistake, Trotsky said about MacDonald, but MacDonald has abused the privilege. So MacDonald comes up here, and a bunch of us knowing who we were, we trailed him around. And he's kibitzing as he's walking through the campus. Well, at that time, the students occupied Hamilton Hall, as I recall, and the faculty bosses were ensconced in what was still is the administrative building, right? Low Library, right? So he goes past Low Library, he stops. He points, and he says, I'll never forget this, there, gentlemen, sits the Duma. That's my story, because what it illustrates is that if you came up here from Indiana and Kentucky, I think, Lauren, it was just amazing how the diaspora, intellectual and biographical, of the Russian Revolution was parked up here on the Upper West Side, and wow, was that an education. And what you get out of it, and here's something Toby said too, you get, and this is the lesson to students, is you really get your intellectual capital probably for the next 20 years. You don't have time to accumulate capital. You're going to live on it now. And boy, it was for me a great period of capitalist accumulation being up here.
One of the themes that Alex spoke about in his opening remarks, and that was resoundingly in the oral history, was the 1990s as a period of crisis, sometimes existential fear, but also reformulation and diffusion in the field of Russian and Eurasian studies. And there were really wonderful and diverse narratives on what the 1990s meant for a place like the Harriman Institute. And I'd like to ask my panelists the following: whether you consider us to have missed opportunities in the 1990s to reinvent ourselves, or whether you think we made the most of them. What lessons does that particular period have for what's happening today in the field of Russian and Eurasian studies? I think I'll start with Stephen and move this way.
Well, I thought about this question that George gave all four of us a lot. And I don't know that I may not agree with the question or fully understand it, because I really don't see the 1990s as this great era of lost opportunities. I mean, in the sense that things can always be done differently and better. But I've become a kind of outlier in Russian studies, so if I do it my way, chances are the majority of the field doesn't think that's the best way. So I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things that happens in the 90s is we see the full social science-fication of the field. I mean, I escaped it. I got a PhD in what was called the government department, but I did a biography as a doctoral dissertation. They won't let you do biography at the history department at Princeton now. They consider it to be not real history. So I just kind of was the last wave of the pre-social science-fication of Russian studies. And I'm not going to say whether that was good or bad, what happened, but I was the last historian in hiding that the Department of Politics ever hired in Princeton, and vowed after me it would never hire again. Not because I wasn't successful there. I was immensely successful, I think, because I was teaching history. I was getting enormous enrollments, but that's not what they wanted the department to be. So I was really the kind of last representative of that, and that, of course, is what my own mentor, Tucker, was. And I think, Lauren, most of us who were in the field at that time were doing history and political science and not worrying too much, except to the extent that the disciplines made us worry about the difference. So let me set into motion a thought I had. I wrote a critical short history of Sovietology as a profession. It's chapter 1 of my book of essays called Rethinking the Soviet Experience. And it was loving but critical. I mean, it was not, I don't like Ingerman's book very much. For one thing, he talked to me for hours, and I didn't see myself in the book at all. He'd made up his mind already. And I don't think he was really a Russianist. I don't think he understood the subject. I don't think he understood what it meant to devote your life to the study of Russia. I mean, there's some interesting things in it, but I didn't brood about the book very much. But here's what I think happened in the 1990s, and it's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis. It only came to me the other night, reacting to your question. And it's obviously not formulated quite right. But until the 1990s, Russian studies had been, as Ingerman said, study thy enemy. We all came, with the exception of very few of us, highly critical of the Soviet system, for different reasons, by the way. It wasn't that there weren't things to like and admire about the Soviet system. Friendship, the way they did science sometime. I mean, we were not, what they thought we were, both wild falsifiers. But generally speaking, the profession operated with a critical edge towards its subject. That changed in the 90s. For the first time in the history the history of the field is not very old, but except for World War II, for the first time, because Washington was down with the Kremlin, the field was down with the Kremlin. And that's where we got these transition studies. We became I don't mean this literally, but too much of what was written was cheerleading for Yeltsin's Kremlin. Not for it and him personally, but for the idea of this transition that we were sure that was underway. And in the field, some of that critical edge that we had carried as Cold Warriors, and I agree with Alex, there's pluses and minuses from the Cold War tradition. Leave the money aside, intellectual pluses and minuses. Too much of the field, more in some disciplines than others, really became cheerleaders for the Kremlin. Now, that had never happened before except in World War II, and it's never happened again, and it probably won't happen again in our lifetime, because we all know we have to oppose Putin and all that. But it did leave a mark on the field. So if you look at the literature then, the field shifted its, I don't know what the word is, but kind of its spirit a little bit. And that was very different from the way it was when, in the 60s, up here at Columbia, where some of us were more Cold War than others, but generally speaking, the orientation was established by the Times, and that changed in the 1990s, I think.
I'd make a different case. I would say that the problem in the 90s was we did not make the case that everything was not different in Russia. We assumed that we had erased the blackboard and we could start and build a new country. Now, I wasn't in academics, I was in the White House at that time. But we assumed that if you destroyed the socialist system and you created a stock market, that would be fine. And nobody in America ever thought, hey, when we created a stock market, we also created an SEC to regulate that stock market. And so we were in a euphoria. I think now we're coming down off that. You know, a lot of people I know say Homo Sovieticus never died. The people got what they wanted at that time. They got a car, they got an apartment, they got to travel, they got to read in the 20 years that passed, but they didn't change the institutions. And we didn't insist on that. We didn't insist that the security services be disrupted and destroyed. Actually, we became the Marxists. We said that if you change the economic system, the mentality will change. Well, Marxism didn't work out so great the first time. Why the hell did we adopt it the second time? So I really feel that we did not address the Russian system as it was, and we didn't understand our own system. And maybe that's a lesson for the Harriman Institute, that you can't just study them without studying us, because it's the interaction that really makes the difference. So as a policymaker, I would give another example, the storming of the White House, which we all thought was, well, you got to do it, you know, you just have to keep Yeltsin in power. I can't tell you how many Russians told me that was the end of the Russian experience with democracy. Why didn't we know that? Or why didn't we have anyone in academics who was looking at that? I'm not blaming the Harriman Institute. I mean, I didn't know it. I thought it was a great thing, you know. I thought I was watching an Eisenstadt movie, you know. And we didn't answer the main question, which to me was the question that the Russian foreign minister kept asking, who I knew very, very well, kept asking me and others. What is the place of Russia in the international system? What does America want Russia to be? and what role should it play given its stature? And if not its positive attributes, the fact that it has huge amount of power and influence in the world. And we never identified that. And so I think that was what was lacking, we were in Washington in the 90s, I wasn't here, was the ability, which is very true of Americans, not to be able to look at themselves and say, how does what we do influence what they do? And I'm not saying that's to say in any way that we're to blame for Vladimir Putin. We're not, I don't think. But we didn't foresee the new challenges. For example, how can you create a new society if nobody understands what civil society is or what the rule of law is? How can you create a new society if corruption never is punished and we turn the other cheek? How do you create a new system when you don't forgive the old Soviet debt like we did with Hungary and Poland? So I think these are questions that we unfortunately get to answer again, because we're now at one of those moments again where we should be asking, what is it we want from Russia? And it's not a question that says, please, pretty please, tell us what we can do so you'll like us again. The Russians will like us. No, no, no. It's a question where both sides ask serious questions about, what do you want this world to look like? And I think for students, you can't answer it. Well, maybe you can, but in like 3 pages. But believe me, when it gets down to Washington, it'll change into a different kind of paper. But we have to start thinking about that and how it is that we interact. And the other thing I would say is that we have to start thinking about power differently. We keep saying Russia is our equal because they have nuclear weapons. Well, unless you believe, and some people do, that we're about to use them, then let's move that equation. Russia has a lot of advantages that we don't, and we see that with disinformation. We see it with the ability to move quickly troops into Syria, move new S-400 systems, to do all kinds of things that are harder for us to do because we have a different kind of system. So the question is, how do we deal with asymmetries in which we are not always the dominant power? And now, I don't know if that's the role of the Harriman Institute, but if it's not the role of the Harriman Institute, I don't know who else is going to do it.
Like Toby, I was not involved really in what was happening at Harriman in the 90s. I can tell you what was happening at Human Rights Watch in the 90s. By that time, although we started with Helsinki Watch focusing solely on the Soviet Union, by the 1990s we were covering the world. And all the other divisions in Human Rights Watch came to us and said, well, your job is over. You have nothing left to do. What are you going to do now? But those of us on the staff, and by that time there were several graduates of Harriman who were on our staff, we knew that things were not going to change. We took advantage of the fact that for the first time we could travel to the various republics and set up connections there, small offices. We formed an office in Moscow, which was really extraordinarily exciting. We did that in 1990 and hired we had both American and in fact, Rachel Denver from the Harriman Institute was our first chief of the Moscow office, and we had a very excellent Russian working with her. And of course, the human rights problems it was only a matter of time. We said, well, give them time. Maybe, they have to get their act together. But Chechnya happened almost immediately, and we were there doing the same work, or different work, in a different kind of access than we did before. I have to say that when I first became involved in human rights, this was in the late 1970s, I did it first as a cause. I never thought that it was going to become my career. And as I veered off into that as a career, I felt sort of guilty that I was sort of leaving the field, that what I'd been trained for was to be an academic or someone in government, that my former mentors here at the Institute would disapprove of what I was doing, even though we had a strong focus on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So it was very rewarding for me to see human rights issues become part of the curriculum here at Harriman, and that we now have professors sitting on our advisory committees, former students on the staff, and 2 of us have received distinguished alumni awards, and we're asked to speak to human rights, to classes here on human rights. So from that point of view, I see it as very positive development.
Well, clearly something went wrong, right? That is, I remember after the Soviet Union fell apart, I was very unhappy that the Soviet Union fell apart. I liked Gorbachev very much, as did Steve, and I thought that what they needed was a gradual, slow liberalization, democratization, with the state staying intact, etc. Instead, we got what I would call liberal Bolshevism or Bolshevik liberalism, and Yeltsin and company brought the whole thing down quickly. People became impoverished, oligarchs were formed. There was a coup d'etat in October 1993 that was supported by America and supported by most of Sovietology as well. I remember very prominent people being in favor of this because we didn't want the communists to come back. The new constitution was put in which a new president of great power for the president. It was fine if you give great power to the president if the president has a heart condition and is a drunkard. But then he appointed, a few years later, a very dour, small, very fit policeman to that position who is still in charge today, right? So someone's responsible, right? People who supported Yeltsin, people who advocated the expansion of NATO and drove Russia into a hole, who were happy that Russia would be isolated, but they should also be like us. So I saw this as the triumph and the limitations of what I would call a liberal hegemony, of a discourse in which we were going to make the world like ourselves. Because somehow magically, people everywhere want to be just like us, and we're the indispensable nation. The world can't do without us, and they want us to do that as well. That kind of hubris, it seems to me, pushed Russia into a certain place, and Russia, we didn't anticipate this because we were not sensitive to it, struck back. Eventually they wouldn't take it. And when they drew lines, the first line was drawn in 2008 in Georgia. A war was fought in Georgia, which Russia did not start, no matter what people think, but the Georgians bombed their own city, Tskhinvali, and Russia reacted and said, no NATO. And the same kind of thing happened in Ukraine as well. It's unfortunate, it shouldn't have happened. I think Putin made serious mistakes by taking Crimea. Now he's got his both feet stuck in eastern Ukraine. I think he would like to get out, but he doesn't know how to get out. Nobody wants Minsk too. So the world that we're in, this kind of new Cold War, if you want to call it that, whatever, is a world that we also participated in making, right? Now, I usually try to look at Russia a little bit more sympathetically. I used to look at the Soviet Union more sympathetically. I think a lot of us at Harriman those days, or the Russian Institute, were what you might call détentistes. We were hoping for the best. And we were led by people like Alex Dallin, who wasn't anti-Soviet, deeply anti-Soviet. He was critical. He had serious qualms about communism and the nature of the system, but he was also looking for openings as well, and we learned from all of those things. What we've gotten, in some ways, is partly, not entirely, of our own making. Well, if you take this détentiste position, Russia will always betray you, right? So you think, okay, we're going to make it good, it's going to be nice, we're going to try to negotiate, and then somebody gets poisoned, a plane gets shot down, and you're right back where you started from, right? You can't, you know, there'll always be something terrible that Russia will do. But we got to think realistically about the situation. Russia's a very weak state. They pay something, they have about 7 to 10% of the defense budget that we have, and I'm not counting NATO, but Putin is very shrewd, very wise, unlike our own leader. He listens, he knows history, and he's ready to play this very weak hand very well, as he's done in Syria, right? So there are lots of problems, but let's not think we're so innocent as long as we try to make the rest of the world just like us.
I'd just like to respond because I have to tell you that as time goes on more and more, I have more sympathy for Russians who didn't protest during Stalin or didn't take any actions when I look around and I see America, where Americans who have absolutely nothing to lose by protesting I don't mean on the street, I mean political leaders, and don't do it. And I think to myself, my God, if we can't do it, what were we thinking? People would be just like us? Maybe that wasn't what we should have been doing. But the fall of the USSR was due to the Communist Party's mismanagement. Okay, it didn't start the day that Yeltsin came in. It was a bankrupt country. The money had been shipped out. The gold bullion had been shipped out. All the phony passport-making equipment had been shipped out. We knew this, and the Russians who were in charge knew this too. Now, you can say that the leadership now is a genius because oil went to $100 and Yeltsin had $8 oil, but I don't think that that's really the case. The industries that were formed in Russia in the 1990s, telecoms, the new industries, those are really the ones that have grown in Russia. It's the ones that are still state-owned and increasingly state-owned that are keeping the country back. And I just like to make this point, and I made this in my presentation, but it's really important, I think, especially for the students. The U.S. has politics, too. I remember sitting around with a group of Russia experts in the White House, and the Russians said to us, why do we have to send food on American ships to Russia? You know, it costs 4 times as much. And we said, well, we have this law, whatever it's called, and, you know, you just have to do it. And somehow when we had a law that was stupid, we just said, well, you know, we have it. And when they had one, we thought it was a defect in the Russian soul or something, which it wasn't. So the example I always remember was someone said, you know, the pensioners are going to vote for the communists, and they're going to vote the communists in. That's why we have to support Yeltsin. And someone said, how much would it cost, Peter knows this, to pay each pensioner? We said about $15 a month times whatever, you know, 30 million, 40 million, $50 million. And they would have gotten their pensions on time. And I remember someone in the president's office saying, but we don't guarantee our own old people pensions. How can we guarantee Russian babushki pensions? And the answer was we couldn't. But if we could have, if we'd had the flexibility that Putin has now to deny his people imports by, you know, destroying food or by blockading Turkey or by, you know, telling 5 million people who work for the security people you can't travel anymore. Well, we could do a lot of things, but you can't do it. So I've had personal experience with Putin. Some of you have too. And yes, he's very shrewd and he has a philosophy, but his philosophy is not necessarily one that we should admire as the way to run a great power. And if we had hubris in the 90s, I just hope we're not entering a period when other countries, which I include Russia, China, and some of the others, have that same sense, because if that happens, we'll be headed for a period where it's not the U.S. that is thinks it's the indispensable nation and finds out it isn't, but it'll be other countries, and I don't think the international system is prepared for that. But I just had to respond because I really think if you think the world began when Yeltsin came in, and that's when the collapse of Russia happened, you just weren't in the country before then. And my first trip was in 1967 as a student, and I go back very, very often. So I just wanted to set that record straight.
George, if you're encouraging dialogue, can I intervene here?
I'm going to forego my last question for the sake of dialogue. Yeah.
So I actually could not disagree more than I do with Toby, most everything she said. But what's interesting about it is it's built into our field of studies. And as Russians like to say, that thought has a right to exist. Isn't that the Russian imеет право существовать or something like that? They're always saying that when they want to pretend like they're democratic. But it does, and it may be the majority view. And this takes me back to the point I was making before. There was a turning point in the 1990s. No one that I can remember, when I was a graduate student here in the 60s, would have said, as Toby just said, we should have insisted on. I mean, this is a whole different attitude about how we think about Russia, what we're teaching ourselves, and what we need to think about. Now, maybe she's right. I don't think she's right, but it exists it's existed as part of our field big time since the 1990s. That what we should be thinking about is what we should tell the Russians they should do. You could say, isn't that arrogant? Isn't that the indispensable nation, all the rest? But, I mean, maybe a case can be made for it. I can't make a case for it, but it's probably a debate we might have sometime at a convention or someplace where we have both sides. So that's one point, because she echoed exactly the pivot I think occurred in the 1990s. The second thing I want to say is that when the Soviet Union ended, and it didn't end the way I think, I've written at length about it, the way Toby, partially, but not entirely the way Toby thinks it ended. I remember Tucker saying to me, nothing terrible. We don't call our program Soviet Studies, we call it Russian Studies. And the Soviet era was another era in Russia's history. And we will now study it as we do the Tsarist era or whatever. It's an era. And then he smiled his wicked way, said it'll probably be really good for historical studies now. The third point I want to make is that I have been interested for autobiographical and intellectual reasons all my career in what I call alternatives. It's what I enjoy studying in history. I don't mean counterfactuals, but why when you take what's on the ground at a historical moment, you take it as given, and then there's one road taken, but there was another road. I'm interested in why that happened. I don't know why I think it's because somebody told me growing up in Kentucky that both the Confederate president and the Union president were both from Kentucky. Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln. So I thought, that's weird. And you think about it, so there must have been an alternative in Kentucky, and I got started. But this is what it seems to me to be we're studying, as opposed to trying to figure out what Russians should do. But why Russia made certain choices at certain moments in history. Now, I'll end on this. Tucker had another idea, which I think is an excellent idea, and is a very good shield against the social scientists who want to turn everything into comparative study. Tucker said, sure, we're comparativists, but we have 1,000 or 400 years of Russian history to work with here, and lots of periods. We should be doing comparative studies within Russian history. So some of Tucker's graduate students did, for example, how the government, Tsarist, Provisional, and Soviet, that was largely, reacted to grain crises. Could you find commonalities in the way the government, it's very interesting, and yet, from a social science comparative point of view, fully comparative. I am just to end, and I'm older, am I the oldest or one of the oldest up here? I am just uncomfortable with a Russian studies whose purpose is to figure out what we should insist that Russia should do. First of all, I think it's folly. It isn't going to change anything in Russia, no matter how much money is involved. We've learned that. And it's not true that in the 1990s, nobody offered an alternative view. I published a book, Failed Crusade. Peter Redaway did the same. We just weren't listened to. What happens in Washington, if you kids out there thinking a career, is they, whoever they are, decide which Russianists they're going to listen to, and they shut out the others. That wasn't always the case, but that too's happened. Clinton was very bad for Russian policy and very bad for Russian studies. It began then. You were either down with the White House program or you weren't. They didn't want to hear anything else. And that remains true right up to today. Bush, Obama, Trump, it's all the same. It was different before. Don't fall asleep. The good stuff is coming.
So,
Why's your father dragged you here tonight? What's going on?
my sense is that we usually get Russia wrong. We've gotten it wrong for centuries. We think it's a country that likes slavery
You
and
personally may have gotten it wrong.
and strong leaders. It needs those kinds of things. We always underestimate Russia, and if possible, we take advantage of Russia, right? Now, no one's apologizing for Russia. I don't particularly like Putin. He's on the wrong side, left and right. He's on the right. And there's a lot of things I would love to have changed in Russia. But I think there were moments we sometimes estimate that Russians like authoritarianism, and they have never really acted in their own interests in a much more, let's say, grounds-up, democratic way. But they have repeatedly. If you go back and study 1917, this was an incredibly radical moment. If you look at the Gorbachev period, right? This was an incredible moment of effervescence, of democratic. If you look at polls in Russia, the kinds of values that people have, elites steal those things from people. Elites then decide to go a different way and to enrich themselves. And Yeltsin is guilty of this. But go and read Taubman's wonderful biography of Gorbachev and see how America treated Gorbachev. Taubman tells a terrible story about how Bush made promises, Bush won, and then broke them or just ignored Gorbachev as the country was sinking. So this is something that, if you're the most powerful country in the world, if you're the one that can really shift things and tell other people what to do and what not to do, you have a responsibility. We played that very badly. And Soviet studies did not help. We did not have enough critical, subversive voices to question this liberal, hegemonic discourse. And because of that, the establishment in Russian studies moved the government. They go in and out of government, that's what they do. And we lose something if we don't have a place like Harriman, hopefully, where there can be an independent group of people with tenure, with academic freedom, who can speak truth to power. And I hope we'll preserve that. And if we don't, we'll just keep making these kinds of mistakes, because there is an arrogance of power in this country which is unprecedented, I think, and it's combined with stupidity at the top and enormous physical power, and that's dangerous.
Well, let me open it up to our audience, everyone around the room. And I wanted to ask, since we have Lauren Graham here, Lauren, did you want to say anything?
Alex.
All the people sitting up there are old friends of mine. I think there is a difference between telling other countries what they should do and observing the arc of history. 300 years ago, practically none of the countries in Europe were democratic. There is an overall arc of development. And that arc of development is towards democracy. That those forms of democracy are different. Sometimes they're more social democratic, as in Scandinavia. Sometimes they're more capitalist, as in the United States. They all have problems, but the evolution toward democracy is unmistakable. I think that Russia eventually will partake in that arc of development. We made the mistake of trying to push it and getting in there at the wrong moment. Some of us thought that arc of development should have gone through Gorbachev. Some of us thought it should have gone through Yeltsin, and we fight with each other over that. The mistake we made was trying to prime the pump and pushing too hard. They would have made it more likely if we hadn't meddled so much.
Would be happy to have more questions, comments, and I see many faces around the room that were part of the oral history as well. Right here.
Thanks a lot. The Harriman's been a big part of my life as a former director and a former student here, so much that I even brought my son here as well this evening. I wanted to say, well, first I have one John Hazard story, because as a graduate student here in my first year, thanks to the great work of Jack Snyder, who got me the opportunity to work in the political science department so I could pay for tuition my first year. So on good days, I praise Jack. On bad days, I say, why did you get me into this horrible field? So I was working there, and John Hazard came up to me, and he said, Tim, do you want to house it for me for 2 summers in my mansion at 94th and 5th. I thought, wow, I'm a starving graduate student. This sounds good. So we often had dinner, and one day we were talking. We said, John, you were in Moscow, 1936, 1937, 1938, during the height of the purges. He told a story about coming in and seeing his law professor replaced with a new professor reading from the same notes, and nobody asking a question because everybody knew. But we were more interested in the personal side, so we said, Ivan Ivanich, you were there for 3 years. Did you meet any Russian girls? And he said, Нет, я жил совсем как монах. He said, no, I lived completely like a monk. So, when I think of the Harriman, it's just been part of me for a long time. And one of the things I learned from Professor Snyder and Professor Hazard is that academia is more than just trying to influence policy. I think and here I'm going to stick up for social science as somebody who is in the political science department now at Columbia, is I think the last 30 years have been a really tremendous time to study Russia and the former Soviet Union, because we can just do things that were inconceivable in the Soviet period. Maybe we're doing them badly, it's quite possible, but we're able to do surveys in just about every country across the region. The administrative data that we're able to collect is much better than a lot of my colleagues from Latin America, certainly Africa, India in some cases. Even for an autocracy, you can do decent public opinion polling in Russia, and that's really a remarkable thing. The other thing I think that's really important is our Russian colleagues. I think when I was a graduate student here starting in 1989, we studied the Institutchiki for what they could tell us about the Soviet system. Now, in the last 15 years, I've had more co-authored papers with Russians than I have with Americans. I run a center in Moscow that's funded by the Russian government at the Higher School of Economics. And, we have to be careful about the kinds of topics that we study. But it's a very vibrant place. We bring through lots of young Russian scholars, young foreign scholars, more established scholars as well. And it's a really exciting time. And, one of the ways, I don't have pretensions to influencing policy beyond, writing academic papers and maybe trying to spin out an op-ed every now and then. But I think by the measure of influence in academia, if you look at the top political science journals, and maybe that's the wrong measure, Russian studies is doing really well in the last decade. I've done some quantitative studies. Yeah, I know it's a sin in some quarters, but if you look at the number of articles in the top academic social science journals that are related to Russia, there's just many more of them, in part because we can do kinds of research that was just very difficult to do before. So, I would like to think, maybe there's some influence down the road in policymakers, but I think in terms of academia, it's a really rich and exciting time in Russian studies.
There's a question at the back of the room.
Hi, I'm Yana Grachovska. I'm a postdoc here at the Harriman, and I actually wanted to just follow on from what Tim was saying. I wonder if the people who participated in the oral history could maybe reflect on what is it that happened in Russia in the last, since you've been examining it, that really surprised you? And why did it surprise you? Not in terms of how we should have influenced policy or any of those sorts of things, but following on from what Tim said, if you had had access to the kind of techniques and materials that historians and social scientists now have access to in Russia, surveys, interviews, on-the-ground research, how would your study of Russia have been different?
And I should say that I remember in your oral history, Stephen, there's a part that answers this question with a couple expletives. So I highly recommend looking for that.
I actually was hoping he would speak, not you, because he looks like he's got something on his mind. I've heard your spiel before. I don't know. I want to hear what he's got to say. So I speak as somebody who never had any methodology. So the whole methodological revolution kind of right over me. But I remember the words of my late great friend, and a friend of many of you, who spent some time at Harriman, I think, Misha Lewin. He was here at least for a year or so, more than one maybe, right. So Misha, who was a combination of Borscht Belt stand-up comic and great theorist and much more, right, Ron? Yes. Was pressed by a bunch of new generation people in the Russian studies field, demanding to know what his methodology was. Now, if you don't know Moshe Lewin, he had written by then and published a lot of what would be called sort of social history, but he was always trying to link it to political outcomes, but he was highly empirical. So people were pushing him, what's your methodology? What's your methodology? So finally he said, well, first, I read. Then I think. And then I write. This is generational. There's no question about it. As I say, I escaped the snare of the obligations of departments to do quantitative and other analysis. And I actually think it's fine that there should be both trends in the field. The problem that worries me is that the trend that I represent is being squeezed out by the nature of university life. And it's nobody's fault. It's the job market. There are tricks around it. Tucker came up with one. If there's a job for a comparativist, and they don't care if you're Latin America, Russia, France, or the United States, say you do comparative within Russian history. I mean, you might be to work with it, but it's a lost battle, nothing tragic, and I think both trends I'd like to see continue to exist, but I think the older one is probably dying pretty fast, except in the history department. So what surprised me? So I can tell you the answer to this very simply, and it's very arrogant. I have a file at home about that thick that I have clipped from the media today when so-called wise people in Washington, and particularly in the intelligence agencies, say that they were surprised. In the last, at least since 2015, they were surprised Putin sent troops to Syria. They were surprised. And they were surprised he moved to take Crimea. They were surprised. So I will be arrogant. I wasn't surprised in the least. Why wasn't I surprised? Because I do alternatives. What are the possible outcomes given the situation? And the other thing I do is I read the Russian press. And both of these possibilities were widely discussed in newspapers near the Kremlin. And so I wonder what the F we're paying all these guys in the intelligence agencies to do if they were surprised. It's not the same as predicting. I would not have predicted that Putin would have gone into Syria, but I would have said on my list of alternatives, it's just near the top. And when what happened, and as Ron says, it was an absolute outrage what the West did, 2013 in Ukraine, but I knew in November 2013 that Crimea might hang in the balance. All you had to do is read the Russian newspapers. And people say, well, what do you mean? And I'll say, well, you remember Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow? He tried to mount a presidential campaign in alliance against Putin, in alliance with Primakov in 2000, right? What was one of his number one planks? Bring Crimea back to Russia. It was in the blood of the Russian political class. Putin showed no interest, but any event could bring it back to the fore of the agenda. This is something that somebody who wants to be a scholar and advise Washington needs to think about, because if these people in the intelligence agencies were surprised, they need to find another line of work.
So, I took a course with Professor Brzezinski on leaders, authoritarian, totalitarian leaders. And the course was divided into two parts. You could pick either a leader who had died and analyze whether what he did was inevitable and had to happen, or you could pick a leader who was alive and you could try to predict what he would do. And it turns out that in every case where the leader was dead, of course it was inevitable that what happened happened. And so therefore, you know, in a case like, you know, Crimea or whatever, well, yes, you know, it was inevitable after it happened. And then the half of the class who had leaders who hadn't died, it was much more difficult to predict what those leaders were going to do. I mean, they had all the same options, you know, take this territory, this new economic policy, you know, a purge, you know, the security forces, the army. And yet there was much more tentativeness about it. So I have a great deal of respect, actually, for the intelligence community. It's not monolithic. There were a lot of people who were surprised. There are some who weren't surprised about some of these actions. I think the real issue is the surprise was that the calculation about an American response was not part of the Russian thinking. In other words, they were going to do it, and the assumption was we would not respond.
So about Crimea?
Right, Crimea or some of the other crises. And again, and I keep returning to this, and I can't help it, it's often we don't put ourselves in the equation. You know, we just don't, because we don't see ourselves. And therefore, when we look at a leader like Putin, he makes an assessment, and he's a very smart man. And the day, I talked to him the day after, this was at a Valdai meeting, I think it was, and when the US had not bombed in Syria. And he said to me, your president owes me one, basically, because I got him out of a situation he didn't want to be in, which was the use of force. And I thought, oh my God, if that's the assumption about America, we're headed for a really, really bad time, because this can happen once, can happen twice, but it can't happen time and time again. The American public, the American leadership will not stand for it. And it turns out that, you know, there were consequences of, you know, and I think most of the community, not just intelligence, but diplomatic people thought that this was a major error. The other one was where he said, I really want you to stay in Afghanistan. I said, why? I said, why should we fight till the last American is dead? I said, you want to go in Afghanistan? Go right ahead. It's right next door. You know, I mean, why are we fighting this? He says, no, it's a very important thing to do. And I just wonder if we're listening to each other at all. And I understand what you're saying, Steve. And, you know, and my intention was never to say the Russians should. It was always preceded by the Americans should. I was much more interested in what we had to do based on what the situation was as we assessed it, and then what their response should be. And their response was often, yes, we should have done that. So it's a much more of a give and take. But I really think we have to consider our own response and think about the risk-taking on both sides. And what I really worry about, you know, what happened that surprised me, is how quickly things can unravel. And that would be my question, my response. How quickly, all the agreements, 15 of them in every field, gone. The exchanges, gone. What's not gone is the personal relationships. You ask anyone here if they still have friends in Russia who speak to them, and I think the answer, I won't speak for everyone, is yes. And I think as long as we have that, we haven't hit bottom. And I don't think we will, because as long as we have people who can say to us, what are you, morons? Why are you doing this? And as long as we can say to them, what do you think you're doing? And you can have that conversation. I think we're in a little bit better shape than we would be if this happened during the Cold War, when we had no communication except somebody in the embassy in Washington, Dobrynin, who could carry a message and keep us that close from crisis. So I'm a little bit optimistic because you guys have opportunities we never had to live in Russian homes, to meet people, to pick up the phone, to say, what's going on? You know, we never had that. I remember I wanted to call Moscow and I would be up. My poor husband had to be up because I was up 2 in the morning. You had to order a phone call. 5 minutes. That's all you got. And the operator gets on, and she rings, and she goes, Moskva ne отвечает. Moscow doesn't answer. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, how have things changed now? You know, everybody answers. Everybody's, you know, that's the positive in our relationship. How low can we go? I don't know. And I'm, you know, my task has always been to make sure we don't go any further down. But it's not because you have rosy visions of Russian leaders or of the Russian people or the Russian soul. You know, it has to be based on a very, I just want to say today's, but a very sober assessment of what's possible, both on our side and on the Russian side.
We're going to tell you a story about Brzezinski. So I got a call, maybe it was 1990, from PBS, and they said they would like to have a discussion about will the Soviet Union fall apart. And they said, Professor Suny, do you think the Soviet Union would fall apart? And I, in all of my knowledge, said, no, never, it won't fall apart. I'm with you, Alex, at that time. They said, oh, good, because Professor Brzezinski said it will fall apart. So we'll have a debate. They set this up. So we get on, and we're on television, and they ask Professor Brzezinski first, do you think the Soviet Union would fall apart? And for whatever reason, I don't know to this day, I have the tape, he said, no, it won't. And I guess I agree with Professor Brzezinski. Well, a year later, I was invited, I'm not sure why, to the Republican senatorial caucus in Williamsburg, Virginia, to debate or talk with James Billington, Library of Congress, and Richard Pipes. And they went first, and I'm a little pipsqueak academic, and they're very famous people. Billington said, as I remember at the time, Gorbachev is a stalking horse for the KGB. This was April 1991, right? There had just been the referendum, and 75% had said we want to keep the Soviet Union. And I said, no, I think that the Soviet Union is committing suicide. By that time, I had come around. And the only thing I remember is that after I was leaving, I had to leave quickly, Bob Dole came around and said, thank you very much. He sort of thought, you know, something big is happening here, and we're not getting the answers we should have gotten. There was a Sovietological establishment, and it was giving the false picture of what was really going on.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex because he informs me that our time is up. Peter and others that want to interact, I think just come up here and talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's carry on the conversation informally. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for being here tonight. And to all members of our community, let's carry on these conversations. They're really important, and you're just wonderful colleagues here. Thank you.